In the winter of 1944 on the Western Front in Europe, the cold arrived earlier than in previous years, and the clouds hung like layers of grey dust settled in the sky, pressed down by the wind, until they formed a low ceiling over the retreating German units. The front line was no longer the winding curve it had been on the maps a year before, but a succession of withdrawal orders, hurried regroupings, and tense supply reports. German logistics and communications units were forced to keep moving, and many clerks and support staff who had once been considered safely far from the front were drawn into the fast current of the war. Ilse Hoffman was pushed forward in precisely this kind of chaos. She came from a small town in Saxony and had originally worked as a clerk in a municipal office. Because she was good at taking dictation and typing, she was drafted into the army as a clerk. She thought she would spend the whole war among files, typewriters, and filing cabinets day after day recording orders decided by others. But when the Allies landed in Normandy and the front advanced rapidly, the rear unit she belonged to did not have time to withdraw and was surrounded almost without resistance in a patch of rain-soaked woodland in France. That day, she did not even manage to take the bound folders of documents with her. Together with other equally frightened clerks and signalmen, she was ordered to raise her hands and walk out of the temporary barracks, becoming one more figure in the column of prisoners of war. From the moment she was captured to the moment she boarded the ship that would carry prisoners of war, her memory was blurred, like a stack of photographs soaked in water, gradually losing their clarity. She remembered long hours of waiting, remembered being divided into groups and escorted to the port, remembered standing on the pier and seeing the vast grey hull of the ship. It was not an enemy warship like the ones she had seen in intelligence files, but a transport vessel, its sides covered with rust and patches of hasty repainting. The voyage across the Atlantic came with violent rolling and stifling compartments, with the spaces between the layers of planks filled with the smells of sweat, salt, and oil. For the first time, she realized that words could no longer decide anything for her here, and that the skills she had once mastered, laying out numbers into neat tables, copying orders into clear, well-structured paragraphs, had lost all value in this place. She was only a number, an object to be counted, registered, and transferred. The first day after arriving at the prisoner of war camp in the United States was the most unfamiliar day of her life. The camp was located near a training facility in the southern United States, far from any city, surrounded by expanses of yellow-brown grass and scattered pine trees. She had never imagined that she would set foot on this continent, and certainly not in this way. The camp, following the regulations of the U.S. Army, was laid out in strict order, divided by fences into several zones: prisoners' barracks, kitchens, warehouses, a yard, and guard towers. The first procedure was registration. Each person gave their name, place of birth, rank, and unit to the clerk, and that information was typed onto index cards for the American archive, while she knew that on the other side, the record about her in German files would probably remain forever fixed on some date months earlier. After medical inspection and a check of personal belongings, they were issued simple work clothes. Apart from the most basic personal garments, most of their original uniforms were taken away. Wearing a bracelet with her number on it, she was assigned to a narrow barrack. The hardness of the wooden bunks made it difficult for her to sleep, and the unfamiliar language and footsteps around her made every half-sleeping, half-waking moment feel especially long. The order of the prisoner of war camp was built on strict roll calls, labor assignments, and meal distributions. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. military was allowed to assign prisoners of war to non-dangerous labor, including kitchen work, farm labor, road maintenance, and warehouse duties. Ilse had originally thought she would be assigned to help with record-keeping, since her handwriting and typing skills had been trusted before the war. But the camp's arrangements were standardized. Those who could do heavy physical labor were sent first to farms or construction crews, while those who were physically weaker or smaller in stature were assigned to the kitchens, sewing rooms, or cleaning details. She was placed in the kitchen cleaning group. Her main daily tasks were sweeping the kitchen floor, collecting empty crates, scrubbing sinks, and taking garbage to the disposal point at the far end of the camp. This work required little skill and did not call for her pen or any paper. She even felt that her world had been deliberately reduced to an extremely small range. Getting up in the morning, eating breakfast, going to the kitchen, sweeping, returning in the afternoon, queuing for food, answering roll call and lights out. The meetings, orders and reports she had once recorded as a clerk were far behind her now. She was no longer a typist or records keeper, only a pair of hands that swept the floor. The kitchen itself was the busiest, noisiest, and most saturated with smells of all the places in the camp. The huge military stoves rumbled in a low register all day long, and steam and cooking fumes drifted back and forth under the ceiling like a thin mist. The shelves were piled with bundles of pots, dark iron basins and metal ladles. Large measuring spoons and meat-cutting knives hung on the walls. The kitchen floor was often scattered with bits of food, onion skins, beans, patches of water not yet wiped dry. Now and then she would see an apple core or two in a corner, something almost impossible to encounter at the prisoners' tables. The exchanges between American soldiers and kitchen staff were mostly quick and casual, their tone relaxed and their movements efficient, but to her those conversations were just a chain of oddly rhythmic sounds with no recognizable beginning or end. She could only rely on gestures to judge when to wheel away the garbage bin and when to put clean, washed metal basins back onto the racks. It was in this kind of daily routine that she first noticed the scraps of paper on the floor. It was one afternoon when, in a brief lull, the kitchen finally grew quiet. The American soldiers had just finished lunch, and the floor was a mixture of footprints and food remnants, with several grease-stained strips of paper scattered in a corner near the storage racks. As she bent down to sweep, she happened to see hurriedly written letters on those scraps, some blurred by sweat or grease. At first she thought they were some kind of military ration form, but immediately realized they were completely different from the military documents she knew. They had no fixed format. The handwriting varied in size. There were lines that had been crossed out and written again, and some numbers had been altered. She looked at them a few seconds longer, only to have a fellow prisoner beside her tug at her sleeve, reminding her not to stare too long in case she drew the attention of a passing guard. In the days that followed, she began to realize that these scraps of paper appeared almost every day. They usually turned up near the trash bins, in the corners of work tables, or on the floor, clearly thrown aside in the rush of cooking. On them were words she could not understand at all, like strings of unfamiliar symbols. She had handled many English letter abbreviations in the office before, but those had almost all been military terms, tank models, artillery corrections, meteorological codes. The arrangement of letters on these scraps, however, was completely different. Some were short, others stretched across the entire line like a long word, and there were even strange combinations she was not sure were words at all. She felt a powerful curiosity and at the same time a deep sense of frustration. Here she could not ask questions or look things up as she once had, and could only let her gaze sweep quickly across the letters and then repeat them over and over in her mind. Until one day she saw a relatively clean sheet of paper beside the trash heap, with several lines of letters clearly written on it. She finally summoned the courage to crouch down and, with a light movement, nudge the paper out from among the onion skins and cardboard scraps, and glance at it quickly. In that instant she saw several words appearing again and again, as if they had been written over multiple times. The visual shock of that moment made her heart beat faster. She suddenly felt a strong desire, one that seemed to come from her abandoned clerk's instinct. She wanted to copy those letters, to catch those scattered clues on paper, the way she had once put order into the chaos of the filing cabinets. She soon realized that it would be impossible to do this openly. The camp rules were clear. Prisoners were not allowed to keep unapproved paper, let alone record text frequently, since the Americans feared secret communication or escape plans. If she wanted to make records, she could only do so without drawing attention. A few days later, while cleaning an old packing crate, she found a small patch of cardboard on the inside wall that was still clean, and she quietly tore off a corner and hid it in the lining of her clothes. On another trip to empty the trash, she found a tiny stub of pencil in the heap, no longer than a fingertip, but just usable. She began using the moments when she bent down to sweep to pretend to adjust her posture, shielding the piece of cardboard with her hand and taking only a few seconds to write down whatever letters she could remember. After work, back in the barracks, she crawled under the bunk and filled in those letters until they formed barely legible words. In this way, the first entries in her dictionary appeared. It was the strangest vocabulary list of her life. The first words on it were flour, sugar, and beans. She did not know what these words meant, but could sense that they appeared with remarkable frequency in the kitchen. Then she noted down coffee, milk, eggs, salt, meat. As someone who had never studied English, she analyzed these terms in the simplest way possible. They repeated often and seemed to label particular things. On the edge of the cardboard, she wrote tiny notes in German, guessing they might be names of foodstuffs, though she was not sure and had no way to confirm it. However, as time went on, she began to notice that the wooden crates and sacks stacked in the kitchen bore some of the same letters. Some labels read flour, some read sugar, and others beans. In the US Army's logistics system, most food labels were clearly printed to allow soldiers to identify them quickly in the warehouse. She compared the letters she had copied from the paper scraps with those on the labels again and again, then shifted her gaze to the contents of the opened bags and crates. For the first time, she saw that flour was a dry, white powder that rose as a faint cloud when it was scattered into the air. Sugar was a fine white crystal that made a soft metallic sound when poured into an iron basin. Beans were hard little pellets that became soft after long boiling in the pot. Using a method almost like learning to read in childhood, she linked these words to real objects. Every time she confirmed a word and found the corresponding item, a long-lost sense of achievement would rise inside her, the faint joy she had once felt in her pre-war office when she found the correct file location for a particular number in the archives. As the entries in her list slowly increased, she suddenly realized an unexpected fact. The words she copied every day had nothing in common with the military terminology she had dealt with before the war. They did not refer to offensives, did not command retreats, and did not describe strategic situations. They were all related to food, taste, and small matters of everyday life. For years in her position as a German army clerk, her notebooks had been filled with records of casualties, transport, supplies, and battle reports. Here, however, the words she handled every day were beans, flour, sugar, milk, eggs. For the first time, a world of language appeared before her in such a gentle form. She felt a strange sensation, as if a thin thread was stretching from the kitchen scraps of paper toward another world she had never truly known, a world not built of orders and maps, but of smells, nourishment, baking, and cooking. Yet the process of exploring this new language was far from smooth. Her fellow prisoners in the barracks did not understand what she was doing. They cared much more about whether it might be possible to get a scrap of potato peel or an extra cup of soup from the kitchen. Some laughed at her, saying that copying those words was meaningless and would one day, at most, trade for a 2 or 3 pound loaf of black bread when they got home, and that she could easily be mistaken by the Americans for leaving secret codes. During one routine inspection of the camp, an American guard found the pieces of cardboard covered in English words under her bunk, and his expression immediately darkened. He clearly took them as a dangerous sign, and she was brought outside the barracks and questioned. Unable to communicate in their language, she could only keep shaking her head and gesturing, repeatedly saying the few words she had heard, but did not know how to spell: kitchen, cleaning. During that period, she had never been so afraid that the traces she had kept merely so she could still feel like a recorder would become evidence that cost her reduced privileges or even led to solitary confinement. In the end, the kitchen supervisor testified that scraps of paper were indeed often thrown to the floor, and the Americans reluctantly accepted that this was only a prisoner's curiosity, not a conspiracy. Her cardboard, however, was confiscated, and she received a stern warning. From that day on, she stopped writing for a time, feeling that this faint goal was both futile and dangerous. Even so, she did not give up completely. The scraps of paper still appeared on the floor every day, and her eyes were inevitably drawn to those letters. A few weeks later, during a period of supply shortages, she saw two lists pinned side by side on the kitchen wall. One was titled POW Menu, the other US Personnel Menu. By then, she could already recognize many English food words in rough outline, and when she saw these two menus, she was struck by a complex emotion. The prisoner of war menu listed beans, potatoes, bread, while the menu for American personnel included butter, fresh milk, meat, fruit, dessert. For the first time, she felt that the words she had been working so hard to learn were here arranged into two very different lines of life, one restrained and monotonous, the other relatively abundant. She remembered the propaganda in the German camps about how the enemy lived in decadence while the soldiers had to endure deprivation, but what lay before her was neither that absurd opposition nor the extreme images depicted in leaflets. What she saw was neither degenerate enemies nor heroic selves, but a simple and sober gap between two systems. One country that could still provide fresh milk and fruit at the end of the war, and another that sent its last food to the front first, leaving children in the rear with only watered-down syrup to drink. For the first time, she felt that learning these words was making her see more clearly the distance between her own country and this unfamiliar one. That distance was not propaganda and not a wartime slogan, but a real difference written between bread, beans, and butter. She fell into a brief period of denial, and for several days hardly wrote down any words, deliberately avoiding looking at the scraps on the floor. Yet when she entered the kitchen again and saw the labels on the wooden crates and the soldiers carefully noting the pounds of flour, that familiar urge returned. She realized that this language was not there to mock her, and not there to remind her of her identity as a prisoner. It was simply presenting a way of life, one that was built on daily routine rather than commands. The language itself held no hostility. Hostility was something that people attached to it. She turned this point over in her mind many times, until the resistance within her gradually faded. One day, as usual, a Red Cross delegation came to the camp, bringing newspapers, second-hand books, and the simplest language learning booklets. Those small booklets contained basic vocabulary such as she, he, eat, cook, and bread. When she was given a worn copy, she could hardly believe her eyes because these words could fit perfectly together with the kitchen vocabulary she had accumulated over the previous months. For the first time, she realized that the words she had been copying in solitude were not merely labels, but components of a usable language that could form simple sentences. In her mind, she quietly repeated phrases like, "We cook beans and they eat bread," using the camp's 3 daily meals to practice word order and meaning. In this way, she built for herself a tiny English world, a barely audible space that belonged only to her. As her understanding slowly deepened, she began to help newly arrived prisoners interpret some of the kitchen rules. She could, for instance, tell them why the quantity of beans on Tuesday's list suddenly doubled, or why certain days showed strange word combinations, which usually meant that one ingredient was being substituted for another. These small explanations allowed those around her to form a clearer expectation of what the next meal might be, and not remain entirely passive, as though a small measure of predictability had returned to their lives. For the first time, she felt that the language she had learned was not just a means of rescuing herself, but could offer others a faint sense of direction. In this place, far from home, poor in information, any hint of what tomorrow might be like served as a thin buffer against fear. At the same time, she began to pay attention to certain patterns in the American kitchen system. She discovered that there were fixed meat days each week, that the menu changed slightly on holidays, and that the quantities of coffee and sugar were always held precisely to specific numbers. She recorded these patterns alongside the words, gradually forming a simple understanding of the logistical system behind the American home front. War was undoubtedly cruel, yet this country still tried to maintain a certain order of normal life, and those lines and tables were not for show, but to preserve basic stability amid disorder. She came to feel that the foundations of civilization perhaps did not lie chiefly in massive industrial complexes or the great achievements lauded in propaganda, but in these everyday details that were carefully written down: how much flour, how much sugar, and how many people needed to be fed. One morning in the spring of 1945, news of Germany's surrender reached the prisoner of war camp. The camp was at first unusually quiet, and then many prisoners simply sat on their bunks in a daze. Some laughed, some cried, and others stared blankly at the floor. The attitude of the American guards became slightly more relaxed, but the process of repatriation did not begin at once. Many men spent months more in the camp, waiting for their names to be checked, for transport to be arranged, for the post-war order to be rebuilt. For Ilse, this period of waiting was like the last segment of her life running in parallel with the world of lists. She knew clearly that she would soon no longer see the crates marked flour, nor would she continue to copy those letters. She began spreading out the remaining scraps of paper and reorganizing them onto a larger sheet, using her habits as a clerk to assemble the stray notes into a single, orderly list. It was like a miniature file, a record of all the traces of life she had experienced in a foreign land. When she was finally sent back to Germany, what she saw there felt like another world. The streets were lined with stretches of rubble. Houses had only half their walls left, and the air carried the smell of dust mixed with burnt wood. People queued in front of ration stations, standing in the cold wind to wait for their meager allowance of food. For the first time, she saw ration lists written in German, and the words on those lists were astonishingly similar to many of the English terms she had once copied in the camp kitchen. Flour, potatoes, substitute coffee, a small amount of sugar, and blocks of butter stamped out of stock with a rubber stamp. In her mind, she could not help lining up these German terms with the English lists from years before, as though two separate moments in time were tied together by a thin thread, one belonging to the prison camp kitchen, the other to the relief stations in the ruins. After the war, many institutions lacked people who could write, handle numbers, and work with documents, and her experience proved unexpectedly useful. She became a registrar at local relief kitchens and ration stations, recording how much food each family was allowed to receive, checking figures, and overseeing supplies that flowed in and out quickly. The way she worked was similar to how she had done clerical tasks in the army, but the objects of record had changed. No longer orders and military losses, but beans, flour, and rations. From time to time, Allied logistical officers or representatives of relief organizations came to inspect, and she was able to use the small amount of English she had learned in the prisoner of war camp to speak with them, explaining the day's distribution and why certain items were in short supply. For the first time, she felt that the words she had copied from those kitchen scraps had somehow helped her reconnect with the wider world amid the wreckage. Years later, when life had finally become more stable, she still kept the final list she had brought home from the camp. The words on it had grown from the original flour, beans, and sugar to include dates and notes added by her own hand. Now and then she would unfold it and look at those hurried letters from long ago, as if seeing another version of herself, a woman in a foreign land trying hard to hold on to written words and refusing to become just an anonymous number. Looking back on her life, from being drafted as a clerk to sweeping floors in a prisoner of war camp to recording rations in the ruins after the war, she understood that her world had always been surrounded by words and numbers. But those records had changed, from war orders to daily needs, from documents that determined other people's fate to lists that maintained a fragile balance between hunger and hope. In the end, she came to understand one simple yet unwavering truth. Civilization is not defined by the weapons and medals on the battlefield, but by the small everyday matters that are written down on paper. How much flour there is today, who can drink a cup of milk, which family will receive enough beans to cook a pot of soup for the winter. Whether a society is willing to record such things carefully and see that ordinary needs are properly met may do more than any slogan to shape the order of life. Those shopping lists that had been casually written and casually discarded in the prison camp kitchen had once taught her the language of an unfamiliar country, and had also given her, for the first time, an understanding of what the language of a peaceful world might be. It was not a national declaration and not a military command, but the vocabulary of how to feed people, how to sustain life, and how to look after the most vulnerable. And it was these words that, in her eyes, were the true weight of civilization.